Mission stood up at my door. I was making coffee. I heard the knock 3 times, quiet, like he wasn't sure he deserved an answer. I set down my mug and walked to the door, and when I opened it, there he was. My son, 36 years old, standing on my porch in the same jacket he'd worn to his wedding 4 years ago, holding a sleeping 5-year-old against his shoulder and a single duffel bag in his other hand. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside. He walked in, laid little Marcus down on the couch, covered him with the throw blanket that's always on the armrest, and then stood there in my living room looking at the floor. He was trying to find the words. I could see it, the jaw working, the eyes going red at the corners. I said, "Sit down, Daniel." He sat, and then he told me everything. It had started 3 weeks earlier, though I'd felt the cracks forming for longer than that. My son married Veronica 4 years ago in a garden ceremony outside Savannah. She was beautiful and sharp, and she laughed at all his jokes, and I remember standing beside my late husband's photograph that night, thinking, he's going to be all right, he's going to be fine. What I didn't see, what none of us saw, was her mother. Patricia Holloway had money the way some people have religion, loudly, constantly, and as a measure of everyone else's worth. She lived in a colonial house in Buckhead, drove a white Mercedes, and referred to the neighborhood my son grew up in as that part of town. She smiled at me at the wedding. She hugged me at Marcus's birth. And for 4 years, she was simply Veronica's mother. A woman I kept at a polite distance because something in my chest always went quiet and careful when she was in the room. I didn't know then that she had been working, slowly, quietly, the way rot works in wood, invisible until the floor gives way. Daniel told me that Veronica had asked him to move out, not because of a fight, not because of anything he'd done. She'd simply come home one evening, set a folder on the kitchen table, and said her attorney had already filed. The folder contained paperwork for the house Daniel had paid for, the house they'd chosen together, the house where Marcus had taken his first steps. According to the documents, the down payment had been gifted by Patricia Holloway, making her a partial owner of the property. Daniel's name was on the mortgage. Patricia's name was on a separate ownership agreement he had never seen before. He hadn't known about it. He had signed so many things around the closing. It had been a hectic week. Marcus had just started walking. Veronica's mother had handled most of the paperwork because she knew a guy, she said, someone who could get it done faster. Daniel had trusted her. Why wouldn't he? She was family. I sat across from my son and I listened to all of it without interrupting. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my face still. Inside, I knew exactly what had happened. And I knew exactly what had happened. And I knew exactly what to do. But I didn't say that yet. Daniel looked up at me finally and said, "Mom, I don't know where to go from here. My name is on that mortgage. I've been paying it for 4 years. And now Patricia is saying the house belongs to Veronica, and her lawyer is already talking about primary custody of Marcus. And I don't know how any of this is legal." I said, "Did you bring the folder?" He blinked. "What?" "The folder Veronica put on the table. Did you bring it?" He reached into the duffel bag and pulled it out. I took it, walked to my desk in the study, and I read every page. It took me 40 minutes. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee I'd poured him and didn't say a word. He knew me well enough to give me silence when I needed it. By the time I finished, Marcus had woken up and wandered into the kitchen in his socks, rubbing his eyes. He looked around the house and then looked at me and said, "Grandma, is this where we live now?" I crouched down to his level and held his face in both hands. I said, "For right now, baby. Just for right now, baby. Just for right now." I stood up and looked at my son. I said, "Make him some breakfast. I have some calls to make." I had worked for 31 years as a paralegal at one of Atlanta's oldest family law firms. I had retired 2 years before Marcus was born, but the relationships I built over 3 decades didn't retire with me. I knew which attorneys were brilliant and which ones were just expensive. I knew how real estate closing documents were supposed to be structured, and I knew from the moment I read that ownership agreement that the signature on page 4 had been witnessed by a notary whose stamp I recognized because I had seen it on fraudulent documents before, twice. Both times in cases involving Patricia Holloway's attorney of record, a man named Gerald Finch. I made 3 calls that morning while Marcus ate his eggs. The first was to a real estate attorney named Carol Webb, who had been my closest colleague for 20 years and who owed me more than one favor. The second was to a former client of the firm, now a forensic document examiner, who had testified in court more times than I could count. The third was to my son's mortgage lender, where I knew the compliance officer personally, because I'd helped his wife through a very difficult custody case 8 years ago, and he had never forgotten it. I didn't tell Daniel what I was doing. Not yet, because Daniel, God love him, has his father's heart. Open and trusting, and completely unable to hide what he knows. If he knew I was building a case, Patricia would know within a week. Veronica would tell her. She told her mother everything. That was actually how this had all begun, though it took me a while to understand the full shape of it. 2 months before Veronica served Daniel the papers, Patricia had approached Veronica with a proposition. The business Daniel had been building, a small but profitable HVAC company he'd started from nothing 5 years ago, had attracted outside interest. A private equity group out of Charlotte had made quiet inquiries. The company wasn't worth a fortune, but it was worth enough. Enough anyway, for Patricia to want it in the family's column rather than her son-in-law's. I didn't know any of this yet, but I was beginning to feel the edges of it. Carol came to my house that Thursday. She sat at my kitchen table with the closing documents spread out in front of her and reading glasses on the end of her nose, and after 20 minutes, she took the glasses off and set them down very carefully and said, "Eleanor, this ownership addendum was not part of the original closing package." I said, "I know." She said, "Someone added it after the fact. The notarization date is 2 weeks after closing." I said, "I know that too." She looked at me over the documents. "You already knew all of this when you called me." I said, "I needed you to confirm it, so it means something in court." She shook her head slowly, but she was already pulling out her notepad. The forensic document examiner, a quiet, precise man named Thomas, came the following Tuesday. He examined the signature pages under magnification and ran the paper stock through a composition test. He called me that evening and told me that the ownership addendum had been printed on paper from a different batch than the rest of the closing package. Different mill, different coating weight. Someone had reconstructed pages from the original document, inserted new ones, and rebound the package. It was carefully done, but not carefully enough. Carol filed a motion to invalidate the ownership addendum on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Gerald Finch had called her office 3 times. That was when I knew we had found the nerve. Daniel found out what I'd been doing when Carol called him directly to go over the motion. He came to my house that evening and stood in the doorway of my study looking at the whiteboard I'd set up. The timeline, the names, the document trail. And he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, how long have you been working on this?" I said, 3 weeks. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you would have called Veronica." He opened his mouth, closed it, sat down. "You would have called her," I said more gently, "because you still love her and you still believe people tell you the truth. And if you'd called her, Patricia would have known we were looking and those documents would have disappeared so fast we'd never see them again." He sat there a while. Marcus was asleep in the back room. The house was quiet. Finally he said, "What do we do now?" I said, "Now I need you to get me everything you have on the business finances for the last 18 months. He looked at me. "Why?" I said, "Because I don't think the house is the only thing they were after." I was right. It took Carol's team and the forensic accountant she brought in another 3 weeks to untangle it. But what they found was this. Veronica had been granted signatory authority on one of Daniel's business accounts 18 months prior. at a time when Daniel had been traveling for work and had signed what he thought was a vendor authorization form. It wasn't. Over the following year and a half, a series of transfers had moved money from that account into a holding company registered in Delaware. The holding company's registered agent was Gerald Finch. The private equity group in Charlotte had since withdrawn their interest. When Carol's accountant dug into why, she found correspondence suggesting that someone had provided them with falsified financial records showing the company operating at a loss. The inquiry had been quietly killed before it ever became an offer. Patricia had not wanted to sell the company. She had wanted to take it. The morning Carol walked into the Fulton County Courthouse with our filing, I was sitting in my car in the parking deck 3 blocks away. I had driven Daniel there and then told him to go inside without me. He'd looked at me like I was abandoning him. I told him I would be right there. I just needed 5 minutes. I sat in the car in the quiet of the parking deck, and I thought about the morning my son had shown up at my door. The duffel bag. The sleeping child on his shoulder. The way he'd stood in my living room looking at the floor. He'd been so ashamed. Not of what had been done to him. He hadn't understood yet what had been done to him. He was ashamed of needing help, of being 36 years old and not knowing what to do. I had not always been the kind of mother who knew what to do. There were years after his father died when I was simply surviving, when Daniel would come home from school and I would be sitting at the same kitchen table and I would look at him and not know what either of us needed. We had fumbled through those years together. He had been patient with me in ways that a child should never have to be patient with a parent. He had never asked me to be perfect. He had only ever needed me to show up. I got out of the car and walked to the courthouse. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Gerald Finch was there with 2 associates. He was polished and unhurried, and he had the manner of a man who expected rooms to arrange themselves around him. Patricia Holloway sat behind him in a gray suit with her hands folded in her lap. And when I walked in, she looked at me with an expression I had seen before, the particular stillness of someone recalculating. She had not expected me to be there. She had known about Carol. She had not known about me. I sat behind my son and I did not look at her again. Carol presented the forensic document analysis first. Thomas testified to the paper stock discrepancy, the notarization date, the construction of the addendum. He was calm and thorough, and he answered every challenge from Finch's team without raising his voice. Then the forensic accountant laid out the business account transfers. 18 months, 17 transactions, a total of $240,000 moved into the Delaware holding company. Finch objected. He argued. He requested continuances that were denied. His voice stayed smooth, but I watched his hands, and by the second hour, his hands were not as steady as they had been. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain and zero patience for theater, invalidated the ownership addendum before the lunch recess. She referred the financial matter to the district attorney's office. Gerald Finch was informed that his conduct would be reviewed by the state bar. Patricia Holloway walked out of that courthouse without looking at anyone. In the weeks that followed, the divorce proceedings restructured completely. Without the fraudulent property claim, the house reverted to Daniel's sole ownership. The custody question, absent the financial pressure Patricia had been using to shape it, resolved into a shared arrangement that both attorneys agreed was fair. Veronica, to her credit, did not fight it. I don't know what passed between her and her mother after the hearing. I don't know if she had known the full extent of what Patricia had done, or only part of it, or none of it. I chose not to spend time on that question. It was not mine to answer. Gerald Finch surrendered his law license 4 months later. The Delaware holding company was dissolved, and after a lengthy recovery process, most of the transferred funds were returned to Daniel's business account. The HVAC company is still running. He hired a bookkeeper and a business attorney, and he changed every signatory authorization on every account. The private equity group from Charlotte resurfaced 6 months later with a genuine offer. Daniel is still deciding. On a Sunday in October, I was sitting on my back porch with my coffee, when Marcus came running out the back door and launched himself onto the chair beside me. He had a book, one of those big, hardcover nature books full of photographs, and he wanted me to look at every page with him. We sat there for a long time, the two of us, going through photographs of ocean creatures and mountain ranges and forests so dense you couldn't see where they ended. He asked me questions I didn't know the answers to, and I told him so, and he found that very funny for reasons I couldn't entirely explain. Daniel came out after a while and leaned against the doorframe watching us. He had a mug in his hand, and he looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been through something hard and are only now, finally, beginning to rest. He said, "You okay, Mom?" I said, "I'm fine." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I keep thinking about that morning when I showed up here and I didn't know what to do, and I was so—" He stopped. "I should have called you sooner. I kept thinking I could handle it myself. I kept thinking you'd be disappointed." I looked at him. "In you?" He shrugged. "One shoulder, the way he's done since he was 12. I said, "Daniel, I have never once been disappointed in you. I have been frightened for you. I have been worried about you. I have been angry on your behalf more times than you know. But disappointed?" I shook my head. "You came to me. That's all I ever needed. You came to me and I was here, and that's how it's supposed to work." He nodded. He looked down at his mug. Marcus turned a page and pointed to a photograph of a blue whale, enormous and quiet in dark water. He said, "Grandma, is that the biggest thing in the world?" I put my arm around him. I said, "One of them, baby, one of them. There is something nobody tells you about being a mother, about being a grandmother, about getting older in general, which is that the moments that matter most don't announce themselves." My son came to my door with a sleeping child in a duffel bag, and I made coffee, and I listened, and then I got to work. That was all. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a speech. But I want to say this clearly, because I know some of you watching this are sitting in a room somewhere feeling like you're out of options, feeling like the ground has been pulled out from under you by someone who smiled at your wedding and held your child and was in your home for years. People who operate the way Patricia Holloway operated depend on one thing. They depend on you being too ashamed, too confused, or too isolated to ask for help. They build the confusion deliberately. They make you feel like you should be able to handle it alone. Like needing someone is weakness. It is not weakness. My son knocked on my door at 7 in the morning and couldn't find the words, and I stepped aside and let him in. That's not a story about me being strong. That's a story about him being brave enough to show up. If you are in the middle of something right now, if someone is using paperwork or money or family ties to back you into a corner, I want you to hear this. There is always a document trail. There is always a date that doesn't match. There is always a signature that can be examined. The people who do these things count on moving faster than you can think. They are not smarter than you. They are just less hesitant. Stop hesitating. Find the folder. Read every page. Make the calls you've been putting off. Knock on the door. And if you've got a mother or a grandmother or someone who has been around long enough to know how these things work, don't wait 3 weeks to call her. Call her now. She already knows what to do.